Okay, welcome back. We just finished up some benefit cost analysis, getting some practice with that with kind of a pollution control example. So we worked on that last class. For in that problem, we had two different two different polluters with each with their own pollution reduction technology. They were able to reduce their pollution. We saw that the 6 ton per year source was able to reduce at a little bit lower cost in present value terms. And we saw that reduction actually had the most net benefits out of the options of doing just the 6 ton source, just the 4 ton source, or doing both. That was the one that made net benefits as high as possible, the present value of net benefits as high as possible. So that was a benefit cost example, and it hints at this idea of the objective of pollution control. The objective of pollution control is to maximize benefits to society in some way. So you want to clean up pollution, and you also don't want to spend too much money doing that, because there's other things that we also would like out of life other than just pollution control. We want some pollution control, but there's other things that we want as well. And so striking a balance between those is key in sort of efficient pollution control. And then there's some concepts, we'll get into some concepts of cost effectiveness versus efficiency. There's efficiency is kind of what we saw in the problem on Monday, where we try to maximize net benefits. We try to choose the level that will give us the most net benefits. That's pushing towards efficiency. Another way to do it would be just to simply say we want to meet a certain target. Maybe it's efficient, maybe it's not, maybe it's too strict, maybe it's too loose, but we want to set a target, and whatever that target is, we want to get there in the most efficient way, like get there in the most cost-effective way. So we want to, whatever the target is, let's try to get there and spend as few resources as possible on the way to achieving that particular target. That's cost effectiveness, which is again, it's independent of what level of pollution control you want. So you could have a very strict pollution control standard, almost too strict perhaps, but you could still, whatever that standard is, you could still try to achieve it using the fewest possible resources. Okay, so that's a concept that we'll get to a little bit later today. We'll talk about some different mechanisms for achieving different levels of pollution. And then we'll get to one of the most interesting theoretical results in environmental economics, which tells you whether or not, depending on the circumstances, it will tell you whether or not a tax policy would be preferred to a quantity policy or a tradable permits policy. And just to preview that briefly, it depends on how steep the marginal damages of the pollution are. If the marginal pollution damages are very steep, you prefer a tradable permit system. If the marginal pollution damages, if the curve is very flat, you'd prefer a tax scheme. When it's uncertain as to whether, like what level the pollution control should be. When there's a little bit of uncertainty, it actually matters whether or not you choose a tax or a quantity policy, which was a result that Martin Weitzman passed away a couple of years ago. He was an economist who came up with this theoretical result in 1974. He wrote a famous 1974 paper called Prices versus Quantities that kind of laid out the argument, the mathematical argument, and the economic intuitive argument for the cases under which a tax policy is preferred to a tradable permit policy. So that's something that I want to get to in a couple days. Not today, maybe not Friday. It might be Monday that we talk about that. But that's, in my opinion, that's one of the coolest results in environmental economics. This is where we've come from. This is from whence we've come. We've just come out of benefit costs, and now we are full on pollution policy. And we've already seen a little bit of this before. We talked about how there's some benefits to pollution control. We talked about how there's some costs, and there's some point in the middle that we'd like to achieve, if we can, we'd like to get somewhere where we're getting some pollution control, we're getting some of the low-hanging fruit, we're getting a lot of benefits out of it, and not having to spend too much to clean that up. Again, because there's other things that we want out of life other than just pollution control. So we're looking for some level that's in the middle, not too strict, not too loose. We want it to be just right. So to think about this, I'll just go over this again. This was part of the microeconomics, but let's say that there's some Qmax level of pollution that's going to occur, whether or not there's any regulation. That's just kind of what naturally firms are going to produce based on what the kinds of goods and services that are demanded in the economy. If you wanted to reduce from Qmax, so Qmax is our baseline, that's like our baseline emissions, and we want to reduce from there. There's a pattern that we would follow. We would want to bring on our lowest cost reductions first. Do those easy things first. That's where you get the most bang for the buck. This is on the x-axis here. This is pollution reduction. So the pollution reduction cost increases as you reduce more pollution, and there's a lot of options we have over here on the left, which are very cheap. So that's kind of like with the sulfur dioxide power plant that we had sort of used as a concrete illustration of this in the microeconomics part. There's measures where we can improve the efficiency of the plant, which is just going to reduce emissions, but also save us a little bit of money along the way. It might be a little bit of trouble to make those improvements, but they're going to, some of the extra expenditure is going to be canceled out by the fact that you save some money as you make those efficiency improvements, right? And then you could switch to lower sulfur coal reserves from different parts of the country that have different sulfur contents. And in that case, when you move to lower sulfur content, you reduce sulfur dioxide emissions. And then as you have to go further and further away to get your supply of coal, you have to spend more to acquire that and bring it to you. So that's going to cost more and more as you try to reach into the reserves that are further away that have lower sulfur. And then eventually you can install some kind of end of pipe technology, some technology that actually filters out, kind of chemically reacts with the smoke and the emissions as it comes out of the stack, chemically reacts with it, and it actually can precipitate out the sulfur and turn it into a kind of a sludge or a mud, and you can dispose of that someplace else and not have it go into the air and affect people's lungs and throats. So that was the abatement cost side. On the damages side, we have this fact that the environment very kindly acts as a sink. It provides sink functions. It's able to absorb wastes at a certain level. It's able to assimilate the wastes. If you dump sewage into water, that water is going to be polluted for a little while, but eventually bacteria naturally are going to eat away at that sewage, and over, depending how much there is, over a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, that sewage will sort of be decomposed and assimilated, and you'll kind of return to purified water just through the natural assimilation processes of the environment, the microbes and the bacteria that absorb and decompose the wastes. At least for organic waste, that's the case. Those services are provided by the environment, but there's a limit. There's a limit to how quickly that can happen, and if the rate of emissions or the rate of pollution exceeds that limit, the rate at which it can be absorbed at, then you start to get pollution buildup, and that's where you get some damages. And those start to mount as you get more and more pollution. So at low levels of sulfur dioxide, you get some things like just reduced visibility. The air might become a little bit hazier. At higher levels, you start to get acid rain, and you start to perhaps damage water resources and forest resources and soil resources as that acid rain falls down and infiltrates the soil. At higher levels, you get eye and throat irritation for human beings that are close by the sulfur dioxide, and then you can get very, very bad effects if you've got a lot of it in the atmosphere and people with asthma especially will have their symptoms exacerbated, and even people without asthma can have fits of coughing. And so those are the different levels of pollution and the ways that they relate to damages. And so you have that pattern of, like, if you think about this as being pollution reduction, the benefits of reduction start high and they go low. The costs start low and they get eventually much higher, and you have some sweet spot in the middle. Okay, that's called the equal marginal principle, where the marginal damages equal the marginal cost of reduction. So that's kind of the goal. That's the goal of what we're trying to do. And as we do that, the marginal cost of reduction that we pay from going from Q max to Q star, the marginal cost of reduction is, sorry, not the marginal, the total reduction costs from going from Q max to Q star is given by A, because that's the area below the curve between the 2 points that you're starting from and the point you're ending at. And then the total benefits of reduction, that's the damages that you avoid from going from Q max to Q star. That would be the entire area below the MD curve, or the marginal damage curve. And so the damages that you'd avoid by going from Q max to Q star. I can write that up here. Damages avoided is A plus B. That's the entire area below the marginal damage curve. And the abatement cost or reduction cost from going from Q max to Q star is just A. It's just the area below the MCR, the marginal cost of reduction curve. So you avoid damages A plus B. You have to spend resources equal to A, and you end up on net you end up with B. B is your sort of net gain from that pollution control. Okay, so that's the idea of efficiency, and that's ultimately the goal of pollution control. I will say, make sure that you are able to be able to figure out total abatement costs given a marginal cost curve. So just the same way that we were able to find total abatement costs as this area A, we were able to find total abatement costs based on the marginal and the change in the pollution quantity. Make sure that idea is clear. Total abatement costs are the area below the marginal abatement cost curve. Total damages avoided that's the area underneath the marginal damage curve. Keep those two things in mind. That's very similar to the kinds of things we've been doing all class long, all semester long. But this is going to be that idea of the areas below those marginal curves representing the total costs and benefits. That's going to come in very handy for analyzing pollution control under uncertainty. The Martin Weitzman 1974 result. The result from 1974 about whether you want a tax or a permit policy, you can understand that result with just graphs. You don't even have to know the math. You can see that with just the graphs, but you have to understand that the areas below those marginal curves represent the total benefits and costs. So that's that idea of those areas below the curves is a very important idea. I've been trying to stress that throughout the semester, but that's going to come in very, very useful for us when we try to analyze how to design pollution policy under uncertainty. And I'll do some more graphical analysis of that later on, probably in another class or two. So that's just to give you a heads up that that's going to be a very important idea to understand. Okay, I had hinted at this idea right at the top. I talked about the difference between efficiency and cost effectiveness. So just to reiterate that one more time, efficiency, we want to maximize net benefits. We want to drive a wedge between the benefits and the costs as wide as possible. That's this thing that I keep drawing. Make that as wide as possible, benefits and costs. That's efficiency. And then this other idea is cost effectiveness, which is we set a target. So instead of trying to drive the wedge between benefits and costs as wide as possible, we set some target quantity of pollution, and we try to hit that target. We want to hit that target by minimizing abatement costs or reduction costs. Abatement and reduction are synonyms. Minimize abatement costs while achieving the target that we've set, achieving Q bar in this case. So that's at a fundamental level, that's the difference between efficiency and cost effectiveness. Efficiency is maximizing net benefits. Cost effectiveness is minimizing abatement costs subject to achieving the pollution target that you want. Okay, so that can be a worthy goal. It's hard to necessarily even know which level of pollution is efficient. That's a little bit hard to define, and I mean we can define it theoretically, but in practice it's difficult to determine. And so one comforting thing we can know is that even if the level that we're shooting for is not precisely the right level, maybe it's not exactly the efficient level that we would theoretically want, we know that if we set it at something, another goal we could have would be to just achieve that as cheaply as we can, spend as few resources as possible to achieve that level of pollution. Okay, so that's cost effectiveness as opposed to efficiency. So there's a number of different ways that we can do that. So there are things that would prescribe particular solutions that polluters should do. So regulations like the 1977 Clean Air Act amendments, that's the CAA is the Clean Air Act, which mandated that sulfur dioxide polluters install expensive technology, end of pipe technology or end of smokestack technology, which would precipitate out the sulfur and turn into a sludge and not go into the atmosphere. That was a particular regulation that required all polluters of that kind to install that equipment. That's an example of a technology standard. There's also emission standards or performance standards which it doesn't prescribe any particular kind of technology, but it does say that there's a ceiling, there's a cap on what any individual polluter can release. You know, like a regulation that would require all cars in a fleet to have a certain miles per gallon. That would be an emissions or performance standard. It doesn't specify exactly how you achieve that, but as long as your vehicle is able to reach that miles per gallon level, then you're in compliance with the emission or performance standard. Broadly speaking, we call those prescriptive regulations. That's in contrast to market-based regulations where you're not so much interested in telling any individual polluter what to do, but you give them flexibility and you care more about what the industry as a whole or what the entire economy as a whole is doing, and you allow maximum flexibility among all the actors in that economy. You allow them maximum flexibility to reduce pollution in whatever way they can, and whoever can reduce at the lowest cost. You allow that flexibility so that whatever the aggregate outcome is, whatever the total emissions target is in the whole economy, you want to be able to meet that at as low a cost as possible. Whereas the prescriptive regulations are interested in each individual polluter meeting a certain standard or having a particular piece of technology, the market-based regulations are more interested in the total emissions, regardless of who they come from, and giving flexibility for how people want to make those reductions, or how the firms want to meet the pollution target. Okay, so those are different means of achieving a target. Let me go through a couple of these in a little bit more detail. These emissions or performance standards, this is a cap on what individual polluters are allowed to release in a given year. So it's either an amount like a total tonnage of sulfur dioxide emissions. Maybe it's just specifying a certain emissions rate, which would be like a miles per gallon. So for every mile or for every gallon of gas that a car uses up, it has to be able to travel a certain distance. That's kind of like an emissions rate. That's a rate-based standard. So it's either total tonnage of emissions or a rate-based standard like miles per gallon. Also, another kind of performance standard you might think about is this ban on on DDT, which sort of came about back in the 50s and 60s as a result of the writings of Rachel Carson. She wrote a book, Silent Spring, in 1958, maybe, kind of about the negative effects of DDT and kind of the effects that it had on birds and other wildlife. And she was actually a very influential writer in terms of sort of spurring the environmental movement in the United States, and eventually leading to a complete ban on the use of DDT, which was a harmful pesticide. So that's an emission standard. It's like basically none. We want none of that. We want none of that in the environment. We're going to ban it. So that's in effect that's a standard. I have some of these advantages here of this. So this is helpful because it actually, to the extent that you can enforce it and monitor it effectively, you can actually guarantee a specific result. You know exactly what's going to happen. You don't give any flexibility to polluters about what they can and can't do, or how they, in what manner they want to reduce the pollution. You put a ban on it, and you can specify a particular result. Whereas, as we'll see later with pollution taxes, you give firms options about, you give them kind of a menu. It's like, here's option A, you can pollute and pay this fine or this tax, or you can reduce your pollution and avoid the tax, and you can kind of take your pick. This doesn't do that. This just says this substance is disallowed. We're not allowing this substance, and so as a result, again, to the extent that we can enforce it, we end up with no amounts of that substance in the environment. That's an advantage, is you can specify a definite result. One problem is that it's inflexible. So it doesn't allow for trade-offs. It doesn't allow for, considering like how costly is it to reduce that substance. Yeah, depending on what other resources you have to spend or give up in order to reduce that pollution, it may not necessarily be wise if you have to give up exorbitant amounts of resources to clean it up, and if the effects aren't that serious, then you don't necessarily want that. So it's inflexible in that way. And also there's this interesting property here. The second bullet point is that there's no incentive to go beyond the standard. And this wouldn't factor into the case of the DDT, because if you're just banning it, then you end up with zero. And so there's no physical way to go beyond the standard in that case. But if a standard is set at some positive amount of pollution, and let's say, and it's some, and it turns out that some polluters have a pretty cheap way of reducing it even further for not that much extra cost, they don't have an incentive to do that at all, because they just get rewarded for meeting the standard. They don't get extra rewards for going beyond the standard. So that's one way that these emissions and performance standards can be not as cost effective, not as beneficial, because there's no incentive to go beyond if there are means to go beyond. So different power plants might have different ages, different vintages. Some might be very old, some might be very new and modern. And the old plants don't have as good of efficiency as the new plants. And so if you have a uniform standard that applies to an entire industry, that standard might be too strict for an old plant, where it would be like almost physically impossible or prohibitively costly for them to try to meet the standard for the old vintages, for the old plants. But at the same time, that standard, which was too strict for the old plants, might be a piece of cake for the modern plants to meet, and they might actually be able to go beyond it. But again, under this sort of uniform emission standard, there's no incentive to do so. It's kind of it's a little bit too much of a one-size-fits-all kind of thing to be cost effective. It guarantees a particular result, but it doesn't give very much flexibility, and it doesn't give incentives for innovation and pushing the boundaries of how to reducing even more if it's possible to do so. All right, here's an example of that idea where there was no incentive to go beyond the standard. We have this graph here. This black line is the actual average fuel economy. This is the miles per gallon of the United States vehicle fleet, and the blue line is the CAFE standard, or the corporate average fuel economy standard. That's the standard set by the EPA that says the fleet of vehicles in the United States have to have a certain, on average, mile per gallon standard. So you have this area over here on the left where, as the standard was increased, the actual fuel economy increased along with it. The actual average fuel economy increased. So producers responded to that regulation by increasing the miles per gallon. And then there was a period of time where the standard was not increased at all. It was just flat. And even though you had a lot of this innovation happening over here in the late 70s and early 80s, once the standard was fixed, then there was no longer any incentive to go beyond the standard, and so the average fuel economy basically just stayed flat until kind of the early aughts when gas prices started to go up, and firms started to anticipate that there was going to be another increase in the CAFE standard. The CAFE standards were set to increase in 2011 here, and so in anticipation of that, the average fuel economy of the fleet sort of increased in anticipation of that increasing standard. But during the period where there was a flat standard, there was no reason for those car manufacturers, to go beyond the standard. And so that's kind of an illustration from the history of the auto industry that shows that when you just have a fixed emission standard, you don't get continued innovation to keep pushing the envelope and trying to achieve better and better pollution outcomes. So if an emission standard or performance standard is strict, technology-based standards are actually even stricter. So this is an even stricter type of policy than the emissions and performance standards. This is actually, it's not saying you have to meet a certain level of performance. This is saying you have to actually use a certain piece of technology. An example of that was the 1975 requirement that all cars have a catalytic converter installed. This is the way that I wrote this is a little bit confusing, but this example here, this 1975 catalytic converter, that's a separate thing from the Clean Water Act, which the language of that Clean Water Act is that point sources of water pollution, these are sources that have a particular pipe out of which their discharges are coming out, as opposed to like agricultural land where it's just the pollutants and the irrigation water and the pesticides run off the land or leak into the groundwater system, and they don't come out of a discernible pipe. Those are a little bit trickier to regulate, but point sources like factories, industrial facilities, wastewater treatment facilities, those kinds of things were regulated under the Clean Water Act, and those required what they called best available control technology. So it's just the language of the act was whatever technology exists that can reduce your discharges of water pollution the most is what you have to use. So that's Clean Water Act is another type of federal regulation which use this technology-based standard and technology-based pollution control regulation. This is convenient because it's very easy to monitor. You can just look at whether the facility or the firm has the technology installed. You can look at whether it's there, and you can maybe you have to inspect it to make sure that it's functioning properly. But it's pretty easy to check. You don't have to have like continuous meters that tell you exactly how much the pollution is coming out every second of the year. It's basically just something that you can look at the piece of equipment and see whether or not it has the technology installed. The disadvantage is that it's even less flexible than the performance standards because it doesn't just mandate a certain level of performance. It mandates that you do a particular thing, that you install a particular thing, or that you use a particular thing. So you definitely don't have any incentive to go beyond the regulation there. You're mandated to use this particular piece of technology, and that's it. Like once you have that, you're in compliance with the law, and even if there's something else that could reduce the pollution more, you have no reason to try to find it or install it because you don't get any credit. You don't get any reward for going beyond the standard. or going beyond the installing that particular technology. And even it's almost even worse than that too, because if you let's say you as a firm have invented some kind of way of reducing your emissions at a lower cost than what the technology mandate says. If that's the case, you would actually prefer to hide it and hide that knowledge from the regulator, because because if it's the case that you have to use the best available control technology, if it's the case that you have to use it, and if the regulator knows about it, you have to use it, and it's costly. If it costs you anything extra than what you're doing already, then revealing that information, revealing that to the regulator, is only going to increase your own costs. So if you invent a piece of new pollution control technology, you're not going to tell anybody about it because you don't get any credit, you don't get any reward for using it. You just sort of penalize yourself by making yourself have to abide by stricter standards, and you don't get any reward. It's just you're just making your own life harder as a firm. So another way of regulating pollution is to provide incentives. So one of those incentives can be a pollution tax. This is a scheme in which the polluters have to pay a per unit tax on every unit of pollution they discharge. This is a signal to the polluters. This is giving them a signal that says, look, this activity you're doing has social costs. It has external costs. You should take those into account when you're making your production and pollution decisions. And then the firm sees that tax and says, okay, I see that it's costly. I see that it's costly for society, and I feel it because I have to actually pay some money for the emissions I'm doing. And then you start to think to yourself, okay, how can I reduce my pollution? Because every unit of pollution that I emit, I have to pay a certain amount of money. So I'm going to be scheming. I'm going to be thinking to myself, what do I do to make that amount as low as possible so I can sort of avoid having to pay as much of this tax as possible. So the firms are going to be like whipped into shape to think about not just like, okay, how can I reduce my pollution, but maybe how can I innovate? How can I adjust my process? How can I invent new processes? How can I invent new pieces of equipment or pieces of technology that will let me keep doing business but have lower emissions? Because now I have a private incentive to do that, because each unit of emissions costs me some money, and I would prefer to keep my money rather than paying it to Washington, D.C. Right? So they have choices and they have incentives. They have flexibility and they have incentives. That's the key. That's the key for this pollution taxes. All right. So there's a way of looking at this which I think is helpful. So let's think back to this Qmax. So we have this Qmax, which is that's the amount of pollution that, let's say that's the amount of pollution that the firm would emit just on its own. If the government left it alone, if everybody left it alone, this is kind of what the natural baseline amount that it would pollute. Okay. So let's say that it's going along, it's polluting Qmax. The government decides, look, this Qmax amount is unacceptable. We need to have a little bit less. Let's put a tax on this. Let's have a tax equal to T1. Let's say they set the tax at T1. So let's look very carefully at what this firm is going to be paying under T1. So under T1, it's polluting Qmax. Its tax burden under T1. So at T1, the tax burden is B plus D plus E plus F, because it's paying T1 for every unit of pollution and it's emitting Qmax. So that's tax rate T1 times the amount Qmax. That's given by this rectangle, right? That's the tax burden. That's the tax burden of the firm if it stays at Qmax. Okay. Let's say that it doesn't want to have to pay any more taxes than it has to. So it thinks to itself, okay, I'm polluting Qmax. What can I do to reduce my pollution? Well, maybe I can adjust. I can maybe rearrange my production a little bit. Maybe increase the efficiency of my plant a little bit. Maybe go and acquire some of my coal from a more distant source that will have lower sulfur content, give me fewer emissions, and I'm gonna keep reducing. And let's say, once I get to Q1, that looks about right. I'm gonna stop at Q1 because the tax rate is T1, and my marginal costs are actually higher than the tax rate after Q1. So I'm gonna stop. I'm gonna stop at Q1. Now the cost to the firm. So we have under, let's say under, this is going to be under T1 at Q1. Let me just adjust this a little bit. So this is at under T1 and at, let me just make this a little bit more precise. This is also under T1, but it's at Qmax. That's the first case. The second case is still under T1, but we're gonna say they pollute at Q1 rather. In that case, the tax burden is it's T1 times the amount of pollution, which is Q1. So that tax burden is B plus D, and then the abatement costs. That's the area below the marginal abatement cost curve or the marginal cost of reduction curve. That's going to be given by everything below the marginal abatement cost curve up to Q1 because they stop at reducing at Q1, so they pay the abatement cost between Qmax and Q1, so that's E. So their total cost is B plus D plus E. And if you've been keeping score at home, that is less than what we had before because we eliminate F. So the firm is actually able to save some money by reducing pollution according to the amount F. And we do that just by comparing the combined tax burden and abatement cost burden under Qmax versus Q1. Okay. That's the concept. That's kind of the intuition and the theory of how firms respond to taxes. And so it gives incentives and it gives choices. It gives the firm the choice of how much it wants to reduce, and it gives them an incentive to do so. It lets them decide, okay, my total cost is less under Q1, so I'm going to choose Q1 because I pay less taxes, and my abatement costs are not as expensive as the tax I would have to pay on the units between Q1 and Qmax. Okay, so that's the idea of pollution taxes. And that brings us to the end of class today. We're going to continue with a little bit more stuff on taxes on Friday, as well as hopefully getting into some material on pollution permits.